In the years preceding America's formal entry into the Second World War, the United States found itself navigating a tense and rapidly shifting global landscape in which economic policy became the most powerful instrument for influencing international events without engaging in open combat. As fascist expansion destabilized Europe and militarist ambitions reshaped Asia, Washington faced the complex challenge of balancing long-standing isolationist sentiment at home with growing evidence that global stability and eventually American security were at risk. The country had emerged from the First World War with a determination to avoid future entanglements, reinforced by the economic trauma of the Great Depression and widespread distrust of foreign alliances. Yet the unprecedented scale of German, Italian, and Japanese aggression during the 1930s increasingly tested the limits of this neutrality. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration understood that the United States could no longer rely solely on traditional diplomacy or moral condemnation to influence world affairs. Instead, the government began using trade controls, financial restrictions, resource allocation, and industrial policy as strategic tools to shape the course of the crisis from a distance. These measures, which evolved from cautious neutrality to active economic pressure, created a unique period in which America was technically at peace but deeply engaged in global conflict through the power of its economy. As a result, the years between 1937 and 1941 became a defining era in which economic policy served as a bridge between isolation and intervention, preparing the nation for a war it had not yet entered but increasingly recognized as unavoidable. The earliest phase of this transformation emerged from the U.S. desire to avoid repeating the perceived mistakes of World War I, particularly the economic entanglements that many Americans believed had pushed the country into the earlier conflict. Congress responded to this sentiment by passing a series of neutrality acts designed to limit trade with warring nations, restrict financial involvement, and prevent American citizens or companies from contributing to foreign military efforts. These laws reflected a belief that by severing economic ties to conflict zones, the United States could insulate itself from external pressures and maintain peace. Yet neutrality proved difficult to uphold as aggression intensified in Europe and Asia. The rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan created a fundamental tension between staying out of war and preventing a global order dominated by expansionist powers. Roosevelt recognized that strict neutrality inadvertently favored aggressors, who often enjoyed greater economic self-sufficiency, while victims of invasion lacked the resources to defend themselves. Thus, the administration gradually sought legal and political room to revise America's economic posture, moving from rigid neutrality toward selective engagement. This shift did not occur overnight, but through a careful rebalancing of trade rules, export controls, and industrial planning that allowed the nation to influence events abroad without directly violating its neutrality laws. One of the most significant features of this transition was the recognition that economic ties could serve as both shields and weapons. For allies such as Britain, China, and eventually the Soviet Union, American industry offered a lifeline, an extraordinary reservoir of raw materials, manufacturing capacity, and technological innovation that could sustain their war efforts when their own resources were strained. For adversaries like Japan, the American economy held essential commodities, especially oil, steel, copper, and aviation fuel, without which Japan's military machine could not operate. As tensions grew, Washington began using this leverage to impose stricter export controls that initially targeted strategic materials and eventually expanded into comprehensive embargoes. The U.S. government believed that limiting the flow of critical resources could restrain Japanese aggression in China and Southeast Asia while avoiding the need for direct conflict. The hope was that economic pressure would force diplomatic negotiation, preserve the balance of power in the Pacific, and keep American soldiers away from foreign battlefields. Yet these measures carried immense risks, as Japan viewed access to raw materials, particularly oil, not as a privilege, but as a necessity, potentially worth fighting for. Thus, economic tools that were initially designed to avert war gradually became catalysts for confrontation, pushing both nations toward a collision neither publicly sought, but both increasingly anticipated. Economic policies also became central to America's evolving relationship with Britain as the situation in Europe deteriorated. After Germany launched its sweeping offensives in 1939 and 1940, Britain found itself desperate for supplies but unable to pay for them under traditional commercial arrangements. Roosevelt responded with innovative programs such as cash and carry, which allowed belligerent nations to buy American goods as long as they paid up front and transported the materials on their own ships. Although designed to maintain legal neutrality, this policy inherently favored Britain and France, who controlled the Atlantic sea lanes, and excluded Germany, which could not safely access U.S. ports. As the war progressed and Britain's financial resources dwindled, the United States developed the groundbreaking Lend-Lease program, which enabled Washington to provide arms, equipment, and supplies without immediate payment. This policy not only revolutionized America's economic relationship with the Allies, but also marked a decisive step away from neutrality. It signaled that the United States viewed its industrial strength as a global asset and a strategic weapon, one capable of sustaining nations resisting Axis expansion even while America remained officially at peace. Lend-Lease transformed America from a neutral state into the arsenal of democracy, intertwining domestic industry with international conflict and laying the economic foundation for later military involvement. Behind these major policies was a sweeping reorganization of the American economy, undertaken with remarkable speed and ambition. The federal government created new agencies to manage production priorities, regulate exports, coordinate with industry leaders, and ensure that critical materials reached the nations most essential to American interests. These shifts required not only legislative changes, but a fundamental rethinking of the role of government in economic life. Factories that once produced consumer goods were encouraged to retool for military production. Shipyards expanded capacity to support British and later American naval needs. And technological innovations were rapidly accelerated through federal investment. Even before Pearl Harbor, the United States had begun transforming itself into a wartime industrial power, reflecting the realization that the global struggle could not be contained indefinitely by oceans or diplomatic barriers. America's economic mobilization was both a preparation for possible conflict and a strategic intervention in the war's outcome, ensuring that Allied nations could continue fighting at a time when their survival appeared increasingly uncertain. At its core, America's pre-war economic strategy represented an unprecedented blend of neutrality and engagement. The United States sought to avoid direct combat while actively shaping the global balance of power through its unmatched industrial capacity and control over key resources. These policies simultaneously reflected caution, strategic calculation, and a growing recognition that the world was too interconnected for isolationism to provide security. By using embargoes, export controls, financial restrictions, and large-scale aid programs, the United States positioned itself as a decisive economic force long before it became a military one. Ultimately, these measures did more than prepare the nation for the war that erupted after the attack on Pearl Harbor. They redefined the role of economic policy in international affairs and demonstrated that industrial strength could be as powerful as armies in determining the fate of nations. In the years leading up to the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe, the United States found itself confronted with a profoundly complex dilemma. how to preserve its long-standing tradition of political neutrality while navigating an increasingly interconnected global economy. The memory of the First World War still hung heavily over the nation. Many Americans believed that the country had been drawn into the conflict not by moral duty but by entangling financial relationships, war loans, and commercial ties. As a result, the interwar years saw a powerful resurgence of isolationist sentiment. Political leaders, advocacy groups, university forums, and civic organizations consistently emphasized the belief that the United States should avoid foreign wars, especially those rooted in long-standing European rivalries. Yet at the same time, the world economy had grown far more integrated than before, and American industries remained deeply woven into global trade networks. Neutrality, therefore, could not simply be a matter of refusing to take sides. It required a careful recalibration of economic policy, trade laws, and diplomatic commitments. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s were designed precisely to prevent the kinds of economic entanglements that many believed had lured the nation into the Great War. Beginning in 1935, these laws sought to impose strict limits on U.S. involvement in overseas conflicts by prohibiting the sale of arms, restricting loans to belligerents, and tightly controlling the travel of American citizens on foreign vessels. The overarching intention was to eliminate the possibility that economic interests might push the country into another devastating war. Policymakers viewed the acts not merely as legal measures, but as safeguards against moral hazards, ensuring that the U.S. economy would not become a tool for foreign powers seeking to gain advantage on the battlefield. The neutrality framework also represented a deeper cultural impulse. Many Americans saw the European conflict as distant and fundamentally unrelated to their national well-being. Yet from the moment they were enacted, the Neutrality Acts presented the Roosevelt administration with a challenging paradox. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized that an inflexible approach to neutrality risked weakening friendly nations whose stability was essential for maintaining global order. As totalitarian regimes expanded their ambitions, from Germany's militarization of the Rhineland to Japan's escalating aggression in East Asia, Roosevelt observed that a strict neutrality stance could inadvertently assist expansionist states at the expense of democratic ones. This tension forced the administration to think creatively about how to balance non-involvement with broader strategic interests. The challenge was not only legal, but conceptual. Could the United States remain officially neutral while still supporting international stability? Economically, the United States found itself navigating competing pressures. American farmers, manufacturers, and exporters feared that strict neutrality would drastically limit their access to foreign markets. During the Great Depression, international trade had already contracted sharply, and many industries were struggling to stay afloat. Any further restrictions on exports, even for reasons of national principle, risked weakening sectors of the economy that were only beginning to show signs of recovery. At the same time, maintaining open trade with nations at war risked accusations that the government was violating neutrality or favoring one side. The Roosevelt administration became increasingly aware that neutrality in the modern world was not simply a diplomatic statement, but also a comprehensive economic policy with far-reaching consequences. The shifting geopolitical landscape of the late 1930s further complicated matters. As conflict escalated in Europe and Asia, American policymakers faced difficult questions about the nature of economic engagement. Could the country trade in non-military goods without indirectly aiding aggression? Were raw materials like oil, steel, and chemicals inherently war-related? These questions were not theoretical. They carried profound implications for both American industry and international diplomacy. Roosevelt's advisors debated whether it was possible to preserve peace by limiting economic interactions with aggressive states, even if such actions created tensions in global commerce. This debate marked one of the earliest signs that economic policy would become a central instrument of U.S. foreign strategy. Public opinion also played a critical role in shaping America's initial neutrality. Throughout the late 1930s, a majority of Americans supported staying out of foreign wars, but views on economic policy were more nuanced. Many believed that helping friendly nations through trade, humanitarian aid, and commercial agreements was acceptable as long as it did not involve military commitments. Influential organizations such as the America First Committee argued that any form of economic engagement with warring nations risked entanglement. Meanwhile, other groups contended that a rigid neutrality would embolden aggressive powers and make eventual conflict more likely. The result was a highly divided political landscape in which economic policy became a battleground for competing visions of America's role in the world. As European tensions intensified, Roosevelt began cautiously adjusting the nation's neutrality stance through administrative interpretations of existing laws. The administration carefully distinguished between defensive and offensive materials, allowing limited trade in certain categories while preserving the broader structure of neutrality. These early modifications set the stage for more dramatic shifts that would follow. The U.S. government soon recognized that the global crisis required flexibility rather than rigid adherence to outdated frameworks. Economic policy gradually evolved into an instrument for shaping international outcomes rather than simply avoiding entanglement. Commercial realities also pushed American neutrality in new directions. Exporters lobbied for rules that allowed continued access to major markets, especially those of Britain and France, which had long been among America's most important trading partners. Business leaders argued that cutting off trade with the Allies would harm the U.S. economy far more than maintaining commercial ties. The administration, aware of these pressures, sought to strike a delicate balance between supporting economic recovery at home while avoiding measures that could be interpreted as war-related collaboration. These tensions underscored the complexity of American neutrality, which was never purely ideological but also deeply intertwined with domestic economic concerns. By the time Germany invaded Poland in 1939, it had become increasingly clear that the United States could not remain completely detached from global events. While the nation reaffirmed its political neutrality, the administration and Congress began exploring ways to modify existing laws to grant the United States greater economic flexibility. Debates in Congress reflected a growing recognition that neutrality did not necessarily require treating all belligerents equally. The fall of Poland and the rapid escalation of the European War forced American policymakers to reconsider earlier assumptions. Neutrality, once viewed as a moral imperative, was gradually becoming an economic and strategic challenge requiring careful recalibration. The outbreak of war also rekindled fears that American industries might become overly dependent on war-related exports, just as they had during World War I. Policymakers sought to avoid a repeat of the economic boom and bust cycle that had followed the earlier conflict. Maintaining a diversified industrial base was essential to long-term national security. Roosevelt's administration therefore aimed to structure neutrality in ways that preserved economic stability without creating an unsustainable reliance on foreign orders. This approach required sophisticated planning as well as close coordination between government agencies, the business community, and diplomatic channels. The administration's early neutrality strategy also reflected broader concerns about hemispheric security. Roosevelt was deeply committed to the good neighbor policy, which emphasized cooperation and non-intervention in Latin America. Protecting the Western Hemisphere from external aggression required careful diplomatic engagement, particularly as Axis powers sought to expand their influence. Economic policy toward the Americas became another component of the broader neutrality framework, with trade agreements, development initiatives, and diplomatic assurances helping to reinforce regional stability. This hemispheric dimension added yet another layer of complexity to the evolving neutrality strategy. As the European continent descended into full-scale war in 1939, the United States confronted the mounting tension between its legal commitment to neutrality and its moral, strategic, and economic inclination to support the nations resisting Axis expansion. The outbreak of hostilities following Germany's invasion of Poland forced American policymakers to re-examine the practical limitations of strict neutrality. While the neutrality framework of the 1930s sought to prevent any entanglement in foreign conflicts, the rapidly shifting global power balance made it increasingly difficult to remain uninvolved. Among these challenges emerged the question of whether the United States could provide selective support to nations fighting aggression without openly abandoning its neutral stance. This dilemma became the driving force behind a series of measured, carefully crafted policy adjustments, foremost among them the cash and carry provisions that gradually tilted American economic policy toward the Allied cause. The global situation in late 1939 differed drastically from previous periods of international tension. The speed and precision of German military operations suggested that Europe could be transformed by Axis domination long before diplomatic negotiations or economic sanctions could affect the situation. British and French leaders understood that their war effort would depend on foreign supplies, especially from American industries, which possessed unmatched manufacturing capacity and access to raw materials. The Roosevelt administration recognized this reality as well, yet paired it with the equally pressing necessity of respecting the legal and political foundations of American neutrality. With public opinion still strongly against entering the war, Roosevelt needed an approach that balanced neutrality with the preservation of American influence in the global order. The cash and carry policy, introduced with the revision of the Neutrality Act in November 1939, represented the first major step in this direction. Unlike the earlier acts, which imposed universal restrictions on trade with belligerents, the new legislation allowed nations at war to purchase non-military goods from the United States on two conditions. They had to pay cash up front, and they had to transport the goods using their own ships. This structure served multiple purposes. It eliminated the financial risks associated with wartime lending, prevented American vessels from becoming targets in contested waters, and ensured that private commerce remained legally separate from military commitments. At the same time, the policy functionally favored the Allies. Britain and France controlled the sea lanes and possessed the naval capacity necessary to retrieve goods safely, whereas Germany, hemmed in by British naval dominance, could not meaningfully participate. This strategic imbalance was not lost on policymakers in Washington. Although the cash and carry framework was framed as an impartial modification of neutrality law, Roosevelt and his advisors understood that it would advantage the Allies without requiring the United States to formally abandon its neutral position. As Roosevelt explained to Congress and to a wary American public, the policy did not represent intervention, but rather the preservation of America's economic rights in the face of global instability. Behind the scenes, however, the administration viewed cash and carry as an essential instrument for preventing a rapid Axis victory. The fate of Europe, many believed, would shape the security and prosperity of the United States for decades to come. Economically, cash and carry had immediate and substantial effects. American industrial production began to revive as orders from Britain and France accelerated. Factories that had suffered from years of Depression-era stagnation found renewed demand for their products. This surge in production did not yet involve large-scale armament manufacturing, but it did require expansion in heavy industry, transportation, chemicals, textiles, and machinery. In turn, the growing need for manufactured goods prompted increases in employment and stimulated regions still struggling with high unemployment levels. The policy thus served as both an economic catalyst and a political compromise. It supported the Allies while providing domestic benefits that strengthened Roosevelt's case for greater engagement. Despite these advantages, cash and carry became the subject of intense debate within the United States. Isolationist leaders argued that even indirect support for nations at war would inevitably draw the country into the conflict. Newspapers, congressional representatives, and public organizations voiced concerns that economic favoritism violated the spirit, if not the letter, of neutrality. The America First Committee, which had not yet reached the height of its influence, warned that any form of commercial cooperation with the Allies would pull American industry into the conflict and ultimately force military commitments. Such arguments resonated deeply with a public still traumatized by the memory of the First World War and skeptical of foreign entanglements. Proponents of cash and carry responded that the policy did not compromise American neutrality because it treated all belligerent nations equally under the law. They contended that the United States had a right to continue commercial activity as long as public funds, military escorts, and American vessels remained outside the conflict. Supporters further emphasized that the policy strengthened the democracies whose survival was essential to the global balance of power. If Britain or France were defeated, the world would shift toward authoritarian domination, making future conflict far more likely. Thus, the cash and carry framework was presented not only as a practical economic provision, but also as a long-term investment in international stability. The broader transformation of American economic policy during this period was not limited to cash and carry. Roosevelt's administration also undertook significant diplomatic and administrative actions to clarify export categories, mobilize industrial information networks, and prepare American manufacturing for potential surges in demand. Even as the president reassured the public that neutral laws remained intact, his advisors were quietly examining the weaknesses in Allied supply chains and seeking ways to strengthen their resilience. American diplomats in Europe gathered intelligence on shortages in materials such as aluminum, chemicals, rubber, and machine tools, sending detailed reports back to Washington. These reports helped shape the administration's understanding of the scale of the conflict and the likely trajectory of Allied needs. The growing partnership between American manufacturers and Allied purchasing commissions formed an essential component of this gradual shift. British and French representatives operating through newly created procurement agencies established offices throughout the United States. Their mission was to negotiate contracts, coordinate transportation logistics, and ensure that orders were filled rapidly. This marked the beginning of an unprecedented level of economic cooperation that transformed American industry into an indirect instrument of the Allied war effort. Factories in New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Michigan, and California soon became critical suppliers of equipment and materials essential for Allied survival. One of the most significant effects of the cash and carry arrangement was the acceleration of domestic industrial modernization. With rising demand for high-quality manufactured goods, many companies invested in new machinery, expanded their facilities, and hired additional workers. These improvements not only met immediate export needs, but also strengthened the nation's industrial base in preparation for potential future mobilization. Federal agencies collected data on production capacity, labor availability, and supply lines, paving the way for later wartime planning. Without explicitly declaring an intent to intervene, the government was building the structural foundations for a mobilized economy. Meanwhile, Roosevelt continued to shape public perception through carefully crafted speeches that emphasized both the dangers of totalitarian aggression and the continued commitment to neutrality. He portrayed American support for the Allies as an unavoidable consequence of their shared democratic values, rather than a deliberate step toward war. This rhetorical strategy helped reduce domestic opposition to the administration's policies, even as those policies nudged the country closer to economic alignment with the Allied powers. Roosevelt's ability to frame cash and carry as a neutral, economically beneficial measure played a critical role in sustaining public approval. At the same time, events in Europe reinforced the necessity of deeper American involvement. The fall of Denmark and Norway in April 1940, followed by the German assault on the Low Countries in France, shocked Americans who had assumed that the conflict would soon stalemate. The collapse of France in June 1940 dramatically altered American perceptions. With Britain standing alone, the United States confronted the real possibility that the last major democratic nation in Europe might fall. This realization intensified the urgency of expanding economic support through both governmental and private means. Although cash and carry had enabled the Allies to secure essential supplies, Britain's financial resources were rapidly dwindling. The war placed enormous strain on British reserves of gold and dollar assets, which were necessary to purchase American goods. As Britain approached financial exhaustion, the limitations of cash and carry became more apparent. Without new forms of economic assistance, Britain might soon be unable to continue the fight. The Roosevelt administration recognized this impending crisis. The evolution of American policy toward Japan during the late 1930s and early 1940s reflects one of the most decisive shifts in U.S. economic strategy before the Second World War. As Japanese expansion accelerated across East Asia, the United States found itself grappling with how to respond to aggression without engaging in direct conflict. Washington hoped that economic tools, especially embargoes, trade restrictions, and financial controls, could restrain Japan's ambitions while preserving regional stability. The challenge lay in employing these measures effectively without provoking open hostilities. The resulting policy trajectory, deliberate, incremental, and increasingly forceful, became a critical component of America's path toward the Pacific War. Japan's aggressive pursuit of territorial expansion began with its invasion of Manchuria in 1931, a move that signaled the onset of a new era of militarism in East Asia. The United States, adhering to principles of international law, announced the Stimson Doctrine, which declared that Washington would not recognize territorial changes brought about by force. Although this stance expressed diplomatic disapproval, it lacked meaningful enforcement mechanisms. Japan interpreted the limited American response as evidence that economic and military expansion would provoke no serious consequences. Over time, the Japanese government intensified its ambitions, seeking greater access to natural resources, strategic territory, and regional dominance. The outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. Japan's brutal campaign in China, including the atrocities committed at Nanjing, shocked American observers and deepened Washington's concerns about Japan's long-term intentions. Yet the United States remained bound by its neutrality laws and by public resistance to involvement in foreign conflicts. Roosevelt's administration faced a profound dilemma. How could it oppose Japanese aggression without violating neutrality principles or triggering direct confrontation? Economic policy emerged as the most viable tool, enabling pressure without military action. Initial steps focused on moral condemnation and limited restrictions. The Roosevelt administration restricted the export of aviation fuel and related materials, citing national security considerations. This measure marked one of the first instances in which Washington used economic leverage rather than diplomacy to counter Japanese actions. Although the restriction had modest effects on Japan's military operations, it signaled a new willingness to use trade policy as a strategic instrument. Meanwhile, Japan's dependence on American oil, iron, and machine tools provided Washington with leverage that could be expanded if circumstances deteriorated. Japan, however, pursued its objectives with increasing intensity. The signing of the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in 1940 underscored Tokyo's alignment with the Axis powers. This development heightened American fears that Japan's ambitions extended beyond China and threatened key Western interests in the Pacific. The strategic vulnerability of the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and British territories made it clear that unchecked Japanese expansion could destabilize the entire region. In response, Washington began reevaluating its export policies, considering stricter controls that would target Japan's military capabilities while minimizing risks of escalation. One of the most significant early measures was the embargo on scrap iron and steel in 1940. Japan relied heavily on American raw materials to fuel its industrial base. Cutting off access to these supplies forced Japan to seek alternative sources, many of which lay in the territories it hoped to seize in Southeast Asia. Although the embargo was framed as a reaction to Japan's occupation of northern Indochina, it also served a broader strategic purpose, signaling that continued aggression would incur escalating economic consequences. Japan interpreted this move as a hostile act, and hardline factions within its government began arguing that the United States was obstructing Japan's rightful place in Asia. Meanwhile, Roosevelt sought to maintain diplomatic communication with Japan, hoping to avoid a confrontation that neither side was fully prepared to fight. American diplomats attempted to persuade Japanese leaders that aggression would undermine regional stability and provoke deeper resistance from Western powers. These talks, however, failed to produce meaningful compromise. Japanese military leaders believed that the United States was angling to preserve Western dominance in Asia, while American policymakers viewed Japan as an increasingly unpredictable force whose territorial ambitions threatened global security. As negotiations faltered, Washington intensified its economic pressure. In July 1941, Japan occupied southern Indochina, bringing its forces closer to critical oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. This move triggered the most consequential American response yet, a near-total freeze on Japanese assets in the United States. The asset freeze effectively halted Japanese purchases of American goods, including oil, which had been the bloodline of Japan's military machine. Although not formally labeled an embargo at first, the freeze amounted to a decisive economic strike that crippled Japan's strategic planning. American officials debated whether the oil cutoff should be absolute or partial. Some believed that limited oil shipments might provide leverage in negotiations, while others argued that any concession would embolden Japan. Ultimately, political pressure and administrative momentum pushed the United States toward a de facto full embargo. The result was devastating for Japan, whose domestic oil reserves were insufficient to sustain prolonged military operations. Japanese leaders now faced a stark choice: withdraw from their territorial conquests or secure new sources of oil through military action. Japan's response revealed the profound consequences of economic coercion. Rather than retreat, the Japanese government concluded that the embargo made conflict with the United States inevitable. Military planners accelerated an ambitious strategy to seize Southeast Asian territories rich in oil and rubber. Yet any such campaign risked conflict with Western forces, including those stationed in the Philippines. Japan's decision-makers began viewing a preemptive strike against American forces as the only feasible path to securing their imperial objectives. The embargo intended to deter aggression thus became one of the catalysts pushing Japan toward war. Throughout this period, American policymakers grappled with the complex interplay between economic pressure and diplomatic objectives. Some officials believed that embargoes would force Japan to negotiate from a position of weakness. Others feared that harsh measures would corner Japan into choosing war. Roosevelt attempted to balance firmness with the possibility of dialogue, authorizing back-channel negotiations that explored potential compromises. These talks, however, foundered on mutual distrust. Japan insisted on retaining its conquests in China, while the United States remained committed to resisting territorial expansion achieved through force. American public opinion also played a role in shaping policy. Growing awareness of Japanese atrocities fostered sympathy for China and support for stronger measures to restrain Japan. The Roosevelt administration used these sentiments to justify tougher economic actions, arguing that American resources should not support aggression. As the conflict in China dragged on, many Americans believed that Japan's military ambitions could destabilize the entire Pacific region and ultimately threaten American security. By late 1941, the combination of embargoes, diplomatic stalemate, and rising tensions had created a volatile environment. Japan's leaders felt increasingly isolated and convinced that time was running out. The United States continued refining its economic restrictions, coordinating with Britain and the Netherlands to limit Japanese access to vital resources. The resulting pressure pushed Japan to its strategic breaking point, setting the stage for the fateful decisions that would follow. The embargo strategy illustrates both the strengths and limitations of economic coercion. On the one hand, the United States used trade controls to project power without deploying military force, demonstrating the growing importance of economics in foreign policy. On the other hand, the policy failed to change Japan's behavior in the manner Washington intended. The embargoes constrained Japan's options but did not convince its leaders to abandon expansion. Instead, they accelerated Japan's decision to pursue a military solution, ultimately contributing to the attack on Pearl Harbor. By examining these developments, it becomes clear that the U.S. embargoes against Japan were not isolated actions, but rather components of a broader strategy shaped by diplomacy, economic leverage, and geopolitical calculation. The measures reflected a belief that economic pressure could deter aggression, yet they also revealed the dangers of miscalculating an adversary's resolve. In the end, the policy demonstrated both the potential and the peril of using economic tools to influence international behavior. The passage of the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941 marked one of the most transformative moments in American economic and foreign policy history. It represented not simply a legislative milestone, but a radical redefinition of the United States' role in the global conflict. For decades, American political culture had stressed detachment from European wars, stressing neutrality as both a moral principle and a practical safeguard. Yet by 1941, the survival of Britain and the broader fate of democratic governments hung in the balance. The fall of France, the relentless German bombing campaign over Britain, and the rapid expansion of Axis power left the United States confronting an unprecedented strategic dilemma. Without abandoning its military neutrality, the Roosevelt administration needed a mechanism to deliver massive assistance to those resisting Axis domination. The Lend-Lease Act emerged as that mechanism, extending American material support to allies on a scale never before attempted, reshaping the nation's industrial capacity and laying the foundations for full wartime mobilization. The origins of Lend-Lease can be traced to Britain's rapidly deteriorating financial situation in 1940. Cash and carry had allowed the British to acquire aircraft, munitions, machinery, food supplies, and industrial materials from American manufacturers. Yet Britain's gold reserves and dollar holdings were draining at an alarming rate. Faced with the escalating costs of the Battle of Britain and the need to replace catastrophic losses in aircraft and naval vessels, British leaders warned Washington that they would soon be unable to continue purchasing American goods under traditional financial arrangements. This looming crisis made one reality unavoidable. If the United States wished to prevent a collapse of British resistance, it would need to provide aid without insisting on immediate payment. Roosevelt's challenge was to devise a system that would bypass the financial constraints of cash and carry without violating the core legal boundaries of neutrality. Direct military intervention remained politically impossible. Public opinion polls in 1940 still showed overwhelming opposition to entering the war, but support for aiding Britain was steadily rising as Americans increasingly viewed the United Kingdom as the last major defender of democratic values in Europe. In this climate, Roosevelt introduced a bold new framework, Instead of selling materials to Britain, the United States would lend them or lease them, allowing repayment to occur after the war, or in forms other than cash. The concept was simple in phrasing, but revolutionary in effect, enabling vast material support without requiring immediate compensation. The Lend-Lease Act authorized the president to supply military and economic goods to any country whose defense he deemed essential to American security. This phrasing broadened the legal foundation for aid, offering extraordinary flexibility in determining eligibility and quantities of assistance. Behind the scenes, Roosevelt and his advisors envisioned the program as a comprehensive tool for sustaining Allied resistance across multiple fronts. Britain was the initial recipient, but the administration anticipated that other nations, including China and eventually the Soviet Union, would require similar support to prevent Axis domination of Eurasia. Debates over Lend-Lease in Congress were intense and often contentious. Isolationists argued that the act would make the United States an arsenal for war, inevitably drawing the country into direct conflict. They warned that supplying weapons and equipment to belligerents constituted a clear abandonment of neutrality. Counters argued that American security depended on keeping Axis powers at bay. If Britain fell, the strategic balance would shift dangerously in favor of authoritarian regimes. Roosevelt framed the act using an analogy that gained lasting fame: lending a neighbor a garden hose to extinguish a fire rather than demanding payment up front. This rhetorical strategy, emphasizing practicality and moral responsibility, proved highly effective in shifting public opinion. Once Lend-Lease passed, the United States embarked on one of the largest material mobilizations in its history. Federal agencies rapidly expanded their operations, establishing complex channels for procurement, quality control, shipping, and inventory management. American industry, still recovering from the Great Depression, now found itself at the center of an unprecedented supply effort. Factories retooled to produce everything from aircraft engines to optical equipment, trucks, medical supplies, spare parts, and advanced weaponry. While the United States had not yet entered the war, the industrial foundation for American military readiness was being constructed through the very process of arming Allied nations. Lend-Lease also transformed the organizational landscape of American economic planning. The Office of Production Management, OPM, created in early 1941, began coordinating industrial output, setting priorities, and identifying bottlenecks in supply chains. This was a significant departure from the peacetime norm, signaling a shift towards centralized oversight of production. The OPM became an early prototype for the far more powerful War Production Board that would emerge after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Through these new institutions, the federal government gained deeper insight into manufacturing capacity, raw material reserves, and labor requirements, knowledge that proved indispensable once full-scale mobilization began. One of the most striking effects of Lend-Lease was its impact on labor and employment. As factories filled Allied orders, demand for skilled workers surged. Industries hired hundreds of thousands of new employees, including women entering industrial labor in greater numbers than ever before. The act spurred growth in sectors such as shipbuilding, aircraft manufacturing, metalworking, and transportation. The resulting economic boom began reducing unemployment dramatically, helping the nation emerge from the lingering effects of the Great Depression. Lend-Lease thus became not only a foreign policy tool, but also a domestic economic engine. The logistics of implementing Lend-Lease were formidable. Allied purchasing agents worked closely with American officials to determine priorities: aircraft to replace losses in the Royal Air Force, destroyers to protect shipping lanes, vehicles for ground forces, and vast quantities of food and medical supplies for civilian and military use. Special supply routes were established, including the perilous North Atlantic convoys that braved German U-boat attacks. Each shipment required coordination among multiple agencies, ensuring that goods were produced on schedule, transported securely, and delivered efficiently. This logistical complexity foreshadowed the even greater challenges that would arise once the United States entered the war. Lend-Lease also played a diplomatic role. America's ability to send assistance signaled a profound shift in the global balance of power. Allied leaders interpreted the act as evidence that the United States was committed to defeating the Axis, even if not yet militarily engaged. For Winston Churchill, Lend-Lease was nothing short of a lifeline. Without American supplies, Britain might not have been able to continue resisting German pressure during its darkest hours. This support strengthened the transatlantic partnership that would later form the backbone of Allied strategy. Beyond Europe, Lend-Lease assistance expanded gradually to other theaters. China, struggling against Japan's occupation, received military aircraft, trucks, medical equipment, and training support. Although logistical difficulties and political divisions limited the effectiveness of aid to China, the assistance symbolized American opposition to Japanese expansion. Later in 1941, following Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to the USSR. This decision shocked many Americans, given deep ideological tensions between the nations, but Roosevelt argued that any nation resisting Hitler contributed to American security. Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union, including aircraft, vehicles, radar systems, boots, food, and aluminum, played a crucial role in sustaining Soviet military operations during critical phases of the war. The scale of material assistance expanded dramatically as the year progressed. American factories produced tens of thousands of vehicles and aircraft under Lend-Lease contracts, while advances in industrial engineering increased the efficiency and reliability of output. At the same time, Lend-Lease deepened economic ties among Allied nations, establishing supply networks that linked North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. These networks not only provided wartime necessities, but also laid the groundwork for post-war economic cooperation, foreshadowing institutions like the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration and eventually broader frameworks of international development. A crucial consequence of Lend-Lease was the shift in American strategic thinking. As the United States moved steadily closer to open involvement in the Second World War, its economic policies evolved into a deliberate form of pressure designed to weaken the Axis and bolster the nations resisting them. By late 1940 and throughout 1941, the Roosevelt administration recognized that traditional diplomacy could no longer counter the escalating aggression in Europe and Asia. Economic warfare, using trade restrictions, financial controls, industrial coordination, and resource denial, became the most potent instrument available to Washington as it remained technically outside the war. This transformation was not a single policy shift, but an accumulation of strategic decisions that reshaped the American role in global affairs. The United States increasingly saw its industrial output, vast raw materials, and financial strength not only as national assets, but as tools that could alter the trajectory of the worldwide crisis without formally declaring war. The resulting measures represented a new stage of international engagement, where production schedules, export regulations, and financial restrictions carried geopolitical consequences just as significant as troop deployments. One of the central elements of this economic campaign was the effort to regulate and restrict access to commodities deemed essential for modern warfare. By controlling shipping routes, tightening export regulations, and aligning American industry with Allied strategic needs, the United States attempted to shape the balance of power long before it fired a single shot. Industrial output was reorganized with remarkable speed, creating new standards for production efficiency and establishing oversight structures that tied factories to national strategy. This reorientation signaled a decisive departure from the pre-war assumption that American industry existed primarily for domestic consumption. Instead, factories became instruments of international policy, supplying the materials that would determine the survival of nations resisting Axis expansion. These steps also strengthened the Roosevelt administration's argument that economic aid could serve as a protective barrier for the Western Hemisphere by keeping potential enemies occupied far from American shores. Financial policies played an equally important role in this emerging system of economic warfare. Washington utilized its influence over international banking networks to restrict access to capital, close loopholes in foreign exchange markets, and block the movement of assets that could be used for military purposes. By freezing the funds of certain countries and tightening the regulations on international transactions, the United States reduced the ability of aggressor nations to acquire industrial equipment and raw materials abroad. These measures reflected a deeper understanding within the administration that modern conflict depended not only on armies and territory, but on financial flows, credit systems, and technological expertise. American policymakers believed that by constraining these channels, they could limit the capacity of the Axis powers to sustain prolonged campaigns, especially in areas requiring heavy industrial output and technological precision. At the same time, the U.S. government intensified its coordination with Britain and other allied nations to ensure that economic pressure was applied consistently and effectively. This effort involved negotiating access to overseas bases, integrating intelligence networks focused on economic vulnerabilities, and synchronizing industrial priorities to avoid duplication. Such coordination marked a fundamental shift in American foreign policy, demonstrating a willingness to engage deeply in global strategy even before the country entered the war. The exchange of information between Washington and London also strengthened the long-term military partnership that would later become a defining feature of the Allied coalition. Through this collaboration, both nations recognized that economic policy could serve as a form of strategic defense, influencing enemy decision-making while minimizing immediate military risk. Economic warfare also extended into the maritime sphere, where the control of shipping lanes became increasingly important. American shipyards accelerated production to address shortages in Allied transport fleets, while new regulations sought to protect merchant vessels from enemy interference. These actions grew more assertive over time, especially as German submarines expanded their campaigns in the Atlantic. Although the United States had not yet entered the war, its merchant marine and naval escorts increasingly found themselves in situations that blurred the line between neutrality and participation. Each confrontation demonstrated that economic policy and military operations were becoming intertwined in practice, even if they remained distinct in legal terms. By enhancing maritime security and coordinating shipments of critical supplies, the United States effectively strengthened its role as the industrial engine of the Allied cause. These policies culminated in a decisive shift during 1941, when economic pressure reached its peak and diplomatic relations deteriorated sharply. The United States was no longer positioned as a detached observer, but as an active participant in shaping the global balance of power. Economic warfare had prepared American industry for the demands of a prolonged conflict, while also demonstrating the limits of neutrality in a world dominated by expansionist regimes. By the time hostile actions made direct involvement unavoidable, the United States had already transformed its economy into a strategic instrument that operated on a worldwide scale. This evolution laid the foundation for the nation's full-scale wartime mobilization and ensured that, once the conflict formally began, it would do so with an industrial and economic system ready to meet the extraordinary challenges ahead.